Sarah was a woman of confidence and grace. She was heading to a business meeting in a distant city, hoping to secure an important deal that could change her career. The early morning flight was the first step towards that goal, and she was excited. She had always believed in the power of hard work, and today was no different. She stood tall as she walked through the airport, dressed professionally but comfortably. The quiet hum of the airport buzzed around her as she checked in and made her way to the gate. She was a little tired from the early start, but that didn't bother her. She was used to long days filled with travel and meetings. She smiled at the airline staff as she showed them her boarding pass. As she made her way down the jetway, she glanced at the crew. Most of them looked busy with their final checks, preparing for the flight. Sarah had flown many times before, so she was used to the routine. She greeted the flight attendants with a polite smile and settled into her seat. Sarah's seat was near the front of the plane. It was always a little more comfortable there. She placed her carry-on bag in the overhead compartment and took a deep breath. She could feel the excitement for her meeting starting to build again. She was determined to make the most of this trip. In the cockpit, Captain Greg Harris was also preparing for the flight. He had been a pilot for many years and was known for his no-nonsense attitude. He often took pride in his authority and believed that every rule should be followed to the letter. He was a man of routine and discipline, but some of his colleagues noticed that his way of handling things could be a bit rigid. He liked to control everything and made little room for exceptions. As the passengers began to board, Captain Harris stayed focused on his tasks, unaware of the interactions happening behind him. His mind was set on the flight ahead, as it always was. Sarah, on the other hand, was simply thinking about the work she had ahead of her. She had no idea that something unexpected was about to happen. She was just another passenger in a crowded airport, going about her day like everyone else. There was nothing unusual about the situation at all. Sarah glanced out the window as the plane began to taxi. The clouds were soft and white in the distance. She let out a small sigh, feeling the calmness that only comes with knowing everything was on track. But that calmness wouldn't last for long. As the plane started to roll down the runway, a small ripple of tension stirred among the crew, but Sarah remained blissfully unaware. This moment, the moment before everything would change, felt normal. It was just another flight, another step toward her goal. But behind the scenes, something was happening that would soon alter the course of the flight in a way no one could have predicted. Sarah couldn't know it yet, but the next few minutes would set in motion a series of events that would leave everyone in shock. And so, the journey began. The plane had just taken off, and Sarah could feel the smooth ascent as the aircraft lifted into the sky. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the familiar sound of the engines calm her nerves. Her mind started to wander as she thought about the upcoming business meeting. She had been preparing for weeks, and now the big day was finally here. Everything was going according to plan, until something strange began to unfold. As the plane leveled out and the seatbelt sign went off, Captain Greg Harris came over the intercom. His voice was clear, but there was a certain coldness in his tone. It wasn't unusual for pilots to make a few announcements, but Sarah, along with other passengers, immediately noticed something different. Captain Harris made an offhand comment about the weather, but then he added a remark that seemed out of place. He mentioned something about how, these days, people don't know how to behave properly in public spaces, in a way that sounded like a criticism. The tone was sharp, and the words felt pointed. Sarah, who had been listening to his announcements, as she always did, paused. She wasn't sure if she had heard it right. It was a brief comment, but it carried a weight she couldn't ignore. She looked around at the other passengers, trying to gauge their reactions. Some seemed indifferent, while others glanced at each other in confusion. Was this a casual remark, or was there something deeper behind it? She shook her head, not wanting to overthink it. Sarah was used to people saying strange things sometimes. Maybe it was just a poorly worded comment, and she had misunderstood. But the remark stuck with her, and she couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was off. As the plane cruised on, Sarah tried to push her concerns aside and pulled out her laptop to prepare for her meeting. She began typing out some notes, focusing on the task at hand. But then, out of nowhere, a flight attendant came to her seat, her face tense. "Excuse me, ma'am," the flight attendant said softly. "The captain would like to speak with you." Sarah was taken aback. She had never been asked to speak with a captain before. It seemed odd. "What is it about?" she asked, trying to hide her surprise. The flight attendant, looking uncomfortable, replied, "I'm not sure, but please come with me." Sarah followed the flight attendant, feeling the growing unease in her chest. Was there some kind of mistake? She walked down the aisle towards the cockpit, her thoughts racing. As she reached the front of the plane, she was greeted by Captain Harris, who stood with a stern expression on his face. "Ma'am," he began, his voice firm, "I need you to leave the plane. I've decided that you can't continue on this flight." Sarah was stunned. "Excuse me, what do you mean?" she asked, unable to hide her confusion. Without offering any explanation, Captain Harris insisted, "There's been an issue. You need to deboard immediately." At first, Sarah thought she had misunderstood. "I'm sorry, but I'm not sure what's going on," she said calmly. "Can you explain?" But the captain simply shook his head, his demeanor cold. "I don't need to explain myself. You have to leave now." Sarah felt her heart race. What was happening? She couldn't believe this was happening to her. There had been no warning, no reason, just a sudden demand to leave the plane. The other passengers looked on, some whispering, but no one stepped in to help her. As Sarah stood there, unsure of what to do, the flight attendants began to look increasingly uncomfortable. It felt as though everyone was waiting for something, waiting for Sarah to either comply or protest. She didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear. She wasn't going to leave without understanding why. But as she looked back at the captain, she couldn't help but notice a troubling realization creeping into her mind. Something about the situation just didn't feel right. Sarah's mind raced as she stood there in front of Captain Harris. She couldn't believe what was happening. Everything had been going smoothly just a few minutes ago, and now she was being asked to leave the plane without any explanation. She felt a wave of confusion and frustration, but she tried to remain calm. "I really don't understand," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of concern. "Why do I need to leave the plane? I'm just a passenger here, like everyone else." Captain Harris, with his arms crossed, didn't answer her directly. Instead, he simply pointed toward the door of the cockpit. "I've made my decision," he said in a no-nonsense tone. "It's not up for discussion. Please exit the plane immediately." Sarah was taken aback. This wasn't just unusual, it was absurd. She glanced around, looking for any sign that someone would step in to explain. The flight attendants were standing nearby, looking uncertain and uncomfortable, but none of them spoke up. The other passengers were starting to take notice of the situation, some watching curiously while others whispered among themselves. Her heart was pounding now. She couldn't help but feel like she was caught in the middle of something she didn't fully understand. She had flown countless times, and she had never experienced anything like this. And why her? Why was she being singled out? "I'm not sure what's happening, but I won't leave until I understand why," Sarah said, trying to stay calm but growing more frustrated. Captain Harris didn't seem to care. He remained unmoved, still standing in the doorway of the cockpit. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he said coldly. "You are a disruption to this flight, and it's my responsibility to ensure the safety and order of everyone on board." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. A disruption. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She hadn't caused any problems, and she had been polite and respectful to everyone. Why was she being treated like this? She tried again, hoping to reason with him. "I'm not causing any trouble," she said. "I don't even understand what I've done wrong. Can you please just tell me what's going on?" But Captain Harris was firm. "I've made my decision, and it's final," he replied. At this point, Sarah realized that continuing to argue might get her nowhere. Her frustration was growing, but she knew she had to keep her composure. The last thing she wanted was to make a scene, but deep inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. With a sigh, Sarah turned toward the door, still in disbelief. She knew she had to leave the plane, but she wasn't about to give up yet. As she walked down the aisle, she thought about what had just happened. What had she done to deserve this? What had prompted the captain to make such a sudden and strange decision? As she stepped off the plane and onto the tarmac, Sarah felt a deep sense of confusion and anger. She didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning of a much bigger story. There was something much deeper at play here, something that no one on the plane had expected. The flight attendants, who had watched the entire scene unfold, looked at each other nervously. Some of them had noticed Sarah's calm and professional demeanor, and now they couldn't help but wonder who she really was. What had she said to the captain that made him act so decisively? But it was too late to take it back now. Captain Harris had made his decision. Sarah had been asked to leave the plane. And now, the consequences of his actions would soon begin to unfold. As Sarah stepped off the plane and walked toward the airport gate, a feeling of shock settled over her. Her mind was spinning, trying to make sense of the bizarre situation she had just experienced. She was still processing the fact that she had been removed from the flight without any explanation or reason. As she stood in the airport lounge, trying to collect herself, she took out her phone to call her husband, Michael. Michael was a successful businessman, and as Sarah had mentioned before, he was the owner of the airline. She didn't often talk about her husband's position in the company because she preferred to be known for her own accomplishments. But now, as the frustration built, she realized it was time to let him know what had just happened. She dialed his number and waited as it rang. Michael picked up on the second ring. "Hello," he answered, his voice warm and reassuring. "Michael, it's me," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm, though there was a tremor of disbelief in it. "You won't believe what just happened." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Michael knew her well enough to tell when something was wrong. "What happened? Are you okay?" he asked, his concern evident. "I was just kicked off a flight," Sarah explained, trying to make sense of the events. "The captain, he told me I had to leave the plane. No reason, no explanation. He just insisted I board." Michael's voice dropped with shock. "What? That's ridiculous. Did you speak to anyone else on board? Was there a mistake?" "I don't know. No one explained anything," Sarah said, still shaken. "The captain was just rude. He didn't even try to listen when I asked why. It felt like he didn't care." Michael's mind raced as he processed the news. He knew the airline had policies in place to handle such situations, but this was something different. This wasn't a case of a misunderstanding or a mistake. Something wasn't right. "Sarah, I need you to stay calm," Michael said after a brief pause. "I'm going to handle this. I'll make some calls right now, and we'll get to the bottom of it." Before Sarah could respond, Michael added, "And Sarah, just to be clear, you know the captain didn't know who you were, right?" Sarah blinked, her confusion deepening. "What do you mean?" "Of course, he knew who I was. Why else would he kick me off the plane?" "No, Sarah," Michael said gently. "The captain didn't know you were my wife. He didn't know you were the owner of this airline. If he had, he would never have treated you like that." The truth hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. In that moment, she realized that the captain had no idea who she was. He hadn't known about her husband's ownership of the airline. He had treated her poorly because, in his mind, she was just another passenger, a black woman, whom he could disregard without any consequences. A wave of anger washed over Sarah. How could he have been so dismissive and rude? She had always prided herself on her professional demeanor, and she knew that no one should ever be treated this way. As she stood in the airport, Sarah felt both hurt and empowered. She was no longer just the passenger. She was the person who had the power to bring about change, and now she knew she had to take action. She wasn't going to let this incident slide. She looked down at her phone, her fingers trembling as she typed a message to her husband, telling him everything she had learned. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about standing up for what was right. The captain's actions had opened her eyes to something deeper, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. Sarah knew that this was just the beginning of a much bigger story, one that would demand answers. And she wasn't about to let it go unanswered. As Sarah walked out of the airport, her heart was still racing. The shock of being removed from the flight, combined with the realization that the captain had no idea who she was, made her feel a mix of emotions. She was angry, confused, and determined. But most of all, she was ready to make sure something like this would never happen to anyone else. When she got into her car, Sarah immediately dialed Michael again. She needed him to know everything, and she needed his support to take the next steps. "Michael," she said, her voice steady but with an edge of frustration, "I need you to listen carefully. I was just treated like I didn't matter. This captain, he didn't just make a mistake. He treated me like I was beneath him, like I didn't belong. I don't care if he didn't know who I was. What matters is how I was treated." Michael was quiet for a moment. He understood his wife's anger, and he knew she wasn't someone who would back down. "You're right, Sarah. This shouldn't have happened. I'll call the airline's legal and PR teams right now. We'll get to the bottom of this." Sarah's heart lightened just a little, knowing her husband was taking this seriously. But deep down, she knew this wasn't going to be an easy process. It wasn't just about her. It was about the bigger issue of how people of color were sometimes treated unfairly, especially in high-pressure environments like air travel. As she drove home, she couldn't stop thinking about the events that had unfolded. She remembered how the captain had spoken to her as though she was a troublemaker, even though she had done nothing wrong. There was something about the way he dismissed her that stung. It wasn't just that he kicked her off the plane. It was the way he did it, with no care or respect. Meanwhile, Michael was on the phone with several key people at the airline. His frustration was building as he realized the gravity of what had just happened. "I want an immediate investigation into this. The captain needs to be held accountable," he said to the head of operations. The airline's legal team jumped into action as well. They knew that this incident had the potential to harm the company's reputation if not handled properly. They began reviewing any available footage from the flight and spoke with other employees who had witnessed what had happened. The goal was clear: find out what led to this decision and take the necessary steps to prevent it from happening again. But Sarah wasn't waiting around for the company to sort things out. She was already thinking about how to move forward, knowing that she couldn't just let this slide. She felt a deep sense of responsibility now, not just for herself, but for anyone who might face similar treatment in the future. Later that evening, Michael and Sarah sat down together in their living room. "I've made some calls," Michael said. "The airline is taking this seriously, but I think it's time we speak up publicly. We can't let this be swept under the rug." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. "I agree. This isn't just about me. This is about making sure everyone is treated fairly. No one should ever feel like they don't belong, especially when they're just trying to get from one place to another." As the evening wore on, Sarah knew this was only the beginning. There was much more to come. But one thing was certain: she wasn't going to back down. The incident on that plane had shaken her, but it had also made her more determined than ever to stand up for what was right. And with Michael by her side, she knew she had the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The next few days were a whirlwind for Sarah and Michael. The incident on the plane had exploded into a public controversy. The media had caught wind of what had happened, and suddenly, the story was everywhere. People were talking about it on social media, in the news, and in the workplace. Sarah never expected her personal experience to turn into such a public matter, but now she felt a responsibility to ensure that the airline and everyone involved took this seriously. While the airline's corporate office was working quickly to investigate the incident, things were getting more complicated. On one hand, they were focused on finding out exactly what happened during the flight, and why Captain Harris made the decision to remove Sarah. On the other hand, they were beginning to feel the weight of the public backlash. People were outraged at the idea of anyone being treated unfairly, especially over something as serious as race. Sarah, meanwhile, was trying to keep herself together. She didn't like the attention, but she knew it was necessary. She couldn't allow this to be brushed aside. She needed to be a voice for herself and for anyone who had ever faced discrimination. Michael, too, was working hard behind the scenes. He had spoken to the legal team, and they were preparing to take action if necessary. He knew that this was going to be a long and difficult road, but he wasn't about to let this injustice stand. The airline had a responsibility to make sure their employees treated every passenger with respect, regardless of their background. As the investigation continued, more details began to emerge. It turned out that Captain Harris had a history of making comments that some staff members had found troubling, but until now nothing had been done to address his behavior. The airline had never received a formal complaint about him before, which made it harder to act. But now that Sarah had spoken out, the company could no longer ignore the issue. Public opinion about the airline began to shift. Some people defended Captain Harris, arguing that it might have been a misunderstanding or a mistake. They suggested that maybe he had been under stress or that Sarah had somehow provoked him. But most people sided with Sarah, pointing out that there was no excuse for how she had been treated. They felt that her race may have played a role in the captain's decision to ask her to leave the plane. The backlash against the airline grew as people demanded accountability. Social media was filled with posts criticizing the captain's actions, with many people calling for him to be fired. Hashtags like #JusticeForSarah and #RespectAllPassengers began trending online. Sarah was overwhelmed by the support she received from the public, but she also felt the pressure. She knew that this wasn't just about one bad experience. It was about a larger problem that needed to be addressed. In a meeting with the airline's leadership, Michael made it clear that they couldn't just issue a simple apology and move on. "This is bigger than just one flight," he said. "We need to make sure that every employee understands the importance of treating everyone equally. We need to start real conversations about diversity and respect." Sarah, too, was part of the discussions. She had made her voice heard, and now she wanted to make sure it was part of a lasting change. She didn't want her experience to be forgotten. She wanted to use it as a turning point to ensure that no one else would face the same treatment she had. As the investigation progressed and the public pressure mounted, Sarah and Michael both knew that this was only the beginning. The airline had to do more than just resolve the situation. It had to prove that it was committed to ensuring fair treatment for everyone, no matter who they were. And Sarah was determined to make sure that the changes needed would take place. As the days passed, the incident on the plane continued to make headlines. The public's outrage was growing, and the pressure on the airline was becoming impossible to ignore. Sarah, who had initially hoped the situation would be resolved quietly, now realized that this wasn't just about her. It was about the need for change in the way people were treated, especially in places like airports and on airplanes. Her husband, Michael, had been working with the airline's legal team to ensure that the right steps were being taken. But it quickly became clear that the issue wasn't going to be resolved without action. Sarah knew that it was time to take the next step: legal action. This wasn't just a matter of feeling wronged. It was a matter of making sure that this kind of behavior wouldn't happen to anyone else. One evening, as Sarah and Michael sat in their living room, Michael spoke up. "Sarah, I think it's time we take formal action. This situation goes beyond just what happened to you. If we don't do something now, the airline may just try to sweep it under the rug." Sarah nodded. She knew he was right. She had been thinking the same thing. She had tried to stay calm and patient throughout the ordeal. But now, seeing the lack of accountability, she realized that this wasn't just a personal issue. It was a fight for fairness. "We need to make it clear that what happened to me wasn't okay," Sarah said, her voice firm. "We need to hold the airline and Captain Harris accountable. If we don't, nothing will change." With Michael's support, Sarah worked with their legal team to file a lawsuit against the airline. The case was based on racial discrimination, emotional distress, and the harm caused to Sarah's reputation and well-being. Sarah knew it wouldn't be easy, and it might take a long time to resolve, but she was determined. The media quickly picked up on the news of the lawsuit, and soon everyone was talking about it. Some people supported Sarah, believing that the airline should be held responsible for how their employees acted. Others, however, questioned whether a lawsuit was necessary, arguing that the situation could have been handled more privately. Despite the mixed reactions, Sarah remained focused. She wasn't doing this for the attention or the fame. She was doing it to ensure that no one else would have to experience the same kind of mistreatment that she had. It wasn't about getting revenge. It was about creating awareness and forcing the airline to take responsibility. Meanwhile, Captain Harris's behavior was being scrutinized. The airline had placed him on temporary leave while they conducted their own internal investigation. The more they dug into his past, the more troubling details emerged. While he had never been officially disciplined before, some flight attendants and other crew members had reported feeling uncomfortable with his behavior and comments in the past. It became clear that he had a pattern of inappropriate actions, but it had never been serious enough for the airline to act until now. As the legal case moved forward, the airline began to face growing pressure. They knew that their reputation was at stake, and they couldn't afford to ignore the situation any longer. Sarah's lawsuit was not just a legal battle. It was a call for change. Through all the challenges, Sarah stood firm. She knew that the road ahead would be long, but she was prepared. She was ready to take on this fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced unfair treatment, especially in spaces where they should feel safe and respected. The days following the lawsuit were filled with intense discussions and growing pressure. The airline, which had initially hoped the situation would die down, quickly realized that it couldn't ignore the public's outcry any longer. News of Sarah's experience and the lawsuit had spread far and wide, and the company's reputation was on the line. People were not just upset about what had happened to Sarah. They were outraged that such treatment could happen in the first place. In a meeting at the airline's corporate headquarters, the CEO addressed the situation. "We can't afford to lose our customers' trust," he said, his voice serious. "We need to show the public that we take these accusations seriously and that we will take responsibility for any mistakes made." The airline's legal team was working around the clock to prepare a defense, but the company knew they needed to take further action beyond just responding to the lawsuit. The CEO called for an immediate review of the airline's training programs and policies. There had been whispers in the past about the need for diversity training, but now it was clear that something more concrete was required. Public relations experts were also brought in to help manage the crisis. The airline issued a formal statement apologizing to Sarah, expressing regret for the way she had been treated, and assuring the public that they were taking steps to prevent such an incident from happening again. In the statement, they announced that they would be reviewing their hiring and training practices, with a focus on ensuring that all staff members understood the importance of treating passengers with respect and dignity, regardless of their background. For Sarah, the apology felt like the first step in the right direction, but she knew it wasn't enough. She was determined to see real change. She had spent too many years working hard for her success, and she wasn't going to let one bad experience undermine everything she had worked for. As much as she appreciated the apology, she wasn't going to stop until the airline put policies in place that would guarantee no one else would face the same mistreatment. While the company worked on its public response, Sarah and Michael continued to push for accountability. They knew that if the airline truly wanted to prove it was serious about change, they would need to take further steps. That meant making sure that Captain Harris's behavior was fully addressed and that real, lasting changes were implemented throughout the company. One of the most significant changes announced by the airline was the introduction of mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all employees, including flight attendants, pilots, and ground staff. The company also committed to creating an independent committee to monitor the progress of these training programs and ensure that they were being implemented effectively. Sarah was encouraged by these steps, but she knew the real challenge would be holding the airline accountable as time went on. It wasn't enough to say the right things in a press release. They needed to prove it through their actions. Despite everything that had happened, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment. She had taken a stand when it mattered, and now the company was being forced to confront the issues it had overlooked for too long. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Sarah knew she had made an impact. The next phase of the battle was just beginning. Sarah's fight for fairness had opened a door for change, and she was ready to keep pushing until she saw that change fully realized. With each step, she knew she was contributing to a movement that would ensure better treatment for everyone, on planes and everywhere else. As the months went by, the impact of Sarah's lawsuit began to be felt not only within the airline, but also across the entire industry. The airline had taken significant steps to address the situation, but Sarah and Michael knew that this was just the beginning of a much bigger shift. They had started a conversation about respect, fairness, and accountability that could not be ignored. Captain Harris, the man whose actions had sparked this entire ordeal, was eventually fired from his position. The airline's internal investigation revealed that his behavior went beyond just one incident. There had been previous reports of inappropriate conduct, but none had been fully addressed. The decision to let him go sent a strong message that the airline would not tolerate mistreatment, no matter who was involved. For Sarah, seeing Captain Harris removed from his position was a moment of justice, but it didn't feel like the end of her fight. In many ways, it felt like the start of something bigger. She had stood up for herself, but now she felt even more motivated to ensure that these changes would continue. She had spent so much of her life working hard to succeed, and this experience had made her realize just how important it was to make sure others were given the same respect and opportunities. As the airline moved forward with implementing new diversity and sensitivity training, Sarah remained involved. She became part of a broader conversation about racial equality in the workplace, using her voice to call for better practices, not just in airlines, but in all industries. She knew that the road to lasting change was long, but the progress was real, and she was proud to be a part of it. The airline, meanwhile, continued to work on rebuilding its image. They had promised to make real changes, and they knew they had to follow through. The CEO made regular updates to the public, sharing the steps they were taking to improve their policies and ensure that every passenger, regardless of background, would be treated with respect. While the road to restoring trust would take time, the company was determined to prove that they were committed to making things right. As Sarah reflected on everything that had happened, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had faced a difficult and unfair situation, but she had stood firm, never allowing herself to be pushed aside. Her actions had not only led to change within the airline, but had also sparked a wider conversation about how people should be treated in all areas of life. Sarah's experience also taught her something important about power. Sometimes, it wasn't about having the most influence or the loudest voice. It was about standing up when it mattered most, speaking out for what was right, and being willing to keep pushing for change, even when the odds seemed stacked against you. In the end, the lessons were clear. Change takes time, but it starts with the courage to speak up. Sarah had shown the world that one person's determination could lead to something much larger than they could have ever imagined. And with that, she knew she had made a difference, one that would last for years to come.